Bueno, buenas tardes. Lo primero es agradecer al Instituto Gioca por darnos este espacio para conversar con Toni Malminen, y en específico agradecer al director Marcelo Alegre y a Federico del Paso por su ayuda. Voy a leer una breve biografía intelectual del profesor Malminen antes de iniciar. Professor Malminen is a graduate of the University of Helsinki and Yale Law School. He's professor of practice in competition law and legal advocacy at the University of Eastern Finland, research fellow at the University of Tampere, and editor-in-chief of Defensor Legis, the law journal of the Finnish Bar Association. Malminen's 2016 doctoral dissertation, The Intellectual Origins of Legal Realism, was translated into Spanish in 2021, entitled Los Orígenes Intelectuales del Realismo Jurídico. Fue traducido por Francisco Campos Zamora y publicado en Tirando Plano. Today talk, the history and future of legal realism is encapsulated in his book and discussed the salience of legal realism in light of current jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of the United States. Well, now I give the floor to the Professor Malminen to make his presentation. Afterwards, we will discuss with him and ask him some questions. Let's go.
Thank you very much. And let me just, it's here. And then, yeah, you have to go presentation. And then, yes, share. And then perhaps you can expand it. It's yes, but you have to close. This one? No. Yeah. Oh yeah, right. All right, welcome and thank you so much for the invitation to the Gioca Institute. It's my first time in this faculty and my second time in Argentina. So I was fortunate in 2001 when I was studying in the United States to visit Argentina and Buenos Aires. I gave a series of lectures at the University of San Andrés, and this is my second time. It's just wonderful to visit this beautiful country again, especially when you are having midsummer while we are having cold winter in Helsinki. And wonderful to see this law faculty as well. And today, as already said, I will be discussing the history and future of legal realism on the basis of the book that was mentioned, The Intellectual Origins of Legal Realism, but also using some examples from the United States, some recent cases from the United States Supreme Court, because I believe that we might have attendees with interest not only in legal history, but in legal philosophy, constitutional theory, probably. So I was thinking of a topic that would be of interest to people from various fields. So even though you are not interested in legal history, you might be interested in some recent cases of the Supreme Court, including the Dobbs case on abortion, or Obergefell v. Hodges on same-sex marriage. So I will be discussing those in light of legal realism. So that's my agenda for today. And let me just, it's always a bit, it's been a while since I've been doing at the corner, this one, yeah. Right. So just briefly, I was already introduced, but let me just mention that I studied law in Finland in the early 2000s. I was, at the time, people like Ronald Walkin, Robert Alexi were quite fashionable in Finland, and I tried to study those figures But I really became interested in legal realism when I was a law student, when I started to read some classics of O.W. Holmes and others. And it seemed to me that they offered sort of fresh look on law. I had studied civil law, I had studied administrative law, all these laws and regulations, but I hadn't really learned that much about how law functions in a society and so forth. And then I encountered legal realists who were all about how does law function, how do judges decide, and so forth. And this seemed to me an interesting novel perspective of law, and I went to study in the United States, where American legal realism obviously originated, and I studied some classics of Scandinavian legal realism. And while I was writing the doctoral dissertation that has now been translated, I practiced antitrust law or competition law, as it's called in Europe, for nearly 15 years. So it's a bit unconventional in Finland. I had a full time legal practice in a big law firm while I was studying legal philosophy and legal history. But now, as of 2022, I'm full-time law teacher. So I gave up on law practice to really focus on law teaching. So that's my background, and that's how I became interested in legal realism. And now I want to discuss the book and what salience legal realism may have even today. So this is just the cover of the book. If you're interested in, at some point of your career, in the intellectual history of legal realism, this is one book you may consult. There are some others, but not that many. And at least the translator felt that, at least in Spanish, no book of as comprehensive as this one exists, and that's why Francisco felt that it would be worth translating into your language as well. So now let's go into some of the main topics and insights of the book. It's a bit different from some other books about legal realism, because I don't focus on judges and legal decision making. And when people usually discuss legal realism, they often think of American legal realism and their focus on how judges work and how they reason. I do discuss it briefly, but this is really about the intellectual origins of legal realism. So why did such a movement arise? What were the key features, key ideas of legal realists, both in the Nordics and the United States? So let me start with three sort of main theses of the book. One is that when people usually discuss legal realism, they think of the 1920s and 1930s. They think of Gerald Frank's Law and the Modern Mind. They might have in mind some early works of Alf Ross and so forth. To me, on the other hand, it seems that legal realism is best seen as a long-term historical phenomenon with actually three distinct stages. So the early beginning, from the 1860s onwards, I'm thinking of studies like Rudolf von Jherin's Der Kampf ums Recht, or The Struggle for Law, his great manifesto on how law is a side of struggle and contest. That had a big influence on O.W. Holmes in the United States, and all legal realists in Europe and the United States were to some extent indebted to von Jhering. So that's to me the early stage of legal realism, when people started to look at law as a source of struggle, something that has to be investigated socially as well. How does it influence society and so forth. Then you have the second stage, which is sort of the golden age or the heyday of legal realism, and that's 1920s and 1930s. This is people like Gerald Frank, Carl Wellin, the late works of Axel Högström, and some of the first studies by Alf Ross and others. This was the golden age. And then I argue that there's a third stage, and that's a gradual decline of legal realism commencing in the late 1930s. And why the late 1930s? I argue that it has to do with the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe and elsewhere, because many people started to say that you are preaching legal realism, you are preaching theory that law is power, it's a conflict. How can you distinguish your theory from Nazism and fascism, which also speaks about power, political power and struggle and so forth? So some people, for instance, in natural law theory, among Catholics, said that legal realism is actually some kind of legal fascism. And many legal realists started to modify their legal realism, became a bit more conservative in their approach. And at the same time, in the 1950s and thereafter, people like H.L.A. Hart began to criticize legal realism, and really the bandwagon switched to perhaps the legal positivism and new kinds of natural law theories, and interest in legal realism began to wane. It's still, in a way, a live tradition in legal philosophy. Some people still read these classics, but it's not really, legal realism doesn't have its golden age or heyday today. Scandinavian legal realism, at least in the English-speaking world, people say it's a museum piece. It really doesn't exist anymore. Perhaps they still have influence in some other parts of the world, but still there has been a bit of a decline in legal realism. So to me, this is really a phenomenon starting in the 1860s and then continuing until 1960 or so, and then becoming sort of a part of the intellectual history of the discipline, but not really a live tradition. My second piece would be that when you read legal realism and think of legal realism, I wouldn't think of it, because often legal philosophy textbooks, they give you a set of great quotations. So you don't really necessarily, you don't read Gerald Frank, you don't read Carl Llewellyn in detail, but you learn some quotations from Frank and decision first, rationalization to follow. And then people discuss not these books as a whole, but these quotations, whether they make sense or not, often saying that, well, this is too radical, this is it's not realistic, this is simply wrong. Whereas to me, legal realism is best seen as a sort of great intellectual shift in Western social thought, which is actually related to some great social transformations of the time, including the second industrial revolution and the industrial strife or labor strife that was common in the late 18th century and the early, not the 20th century, before the rise of the welfare state. The advance of secularization, that seems to be quite a big part of legal realism, that it's part of the disenchantment of the world, as Max Weber called it. This is a way to speak about law in a disenchanted fashion. So law is not something religious, it's not really majestic, it's really a topic of social science. It's a phenomenon in society, and we can discuss it scientifically. So to me, it's part of a secularization of the Western social thought, and then it's somehow related to the coming of the regulatory welfare state. So this is legal philosophy that's quite easily suitable for a regulatory welfare state where the government is active in regulating the economy and society. And then my third thesis would be that we shouldn't think of legal realism only as a theory of legal decision-making or a theory about validity of law, but rather in the 1920s and 1930s, in that historical context, as an antidote to various metaphysical ideas, often even associated with Nazism and fascism. Because some people in the 1930s and 1940s said that, well, if you are preaching that law is politics, that law is power, you are somehow associated with fascism. But in fact, if you look at what people like Gerald Frank, Felix Gowen, Al Frost, these were actually opponents of fascism and various kinds of authoritarian thought. Also, Catholic natural law theory, that's authoritarian as well at the time. So I would treat these figures as people who live in a time of rise of fascism and Nazism and various authoritarian ideas, and being committed to science, liberalism, and so forth. That's my third thesis. And let's flesh out some details. And if you look at the book itself, it has actually three big chapters. One on critical historicism, one on secularization or the disenchantment of the world, and one on phenomenon I call agonism. The idea that law is a struggle, it's a side of struggle and conflict. And I argue in this book that we have been too focused on some aspects of legal realism, including theory of legal decision-making or how judges decide. That has been the key focus on American legal realism and Scandinavian legal realism. Most people associate with anti-metaphysical attitude and perhaps moral non-cognitivism or emotivism. That's a skeptical moral philosophy. I do think that those are important topics as well, but why I wrote such a book is that it doesn't always make sense to rehash old debates. So if you have already 100 books on legal decision making, it seemed to me that I don't want to write the 101st book on how Gerald Frank described legal decision making. So I wanted to read the original sources and see whether you can find a fresh perspective on legal realism. And while I was reading, it took a decade, basically, even 12 years. I was practicing at the same time, so that explains it a bit. But also, I did use considerable time to read the original sources and trying to have fresh look, what are these people arguing, in fact. And it seemed to me that critical historicism, disenchantment, and agonism are a big part of legal realism. So I want to discuss those three phenomena in some detail. And now I will argue that these may have some salience even today, not only as a historical phenomenon. So let's start with what I call critical historicism. And now I want to go into the Supreme Court of the United States, because as you know, probably, the United States Supreme Court has, since the 1980s, been quite fascinated with legal history. And it has to do with the constitutional philosophy called originalism. So the argument that the Supreme Court it's bound by history, it's bound by the founding of the US Republic and the original Constitution. So often it's funny to read decisions by the US Supreme Court on abortion or same-sex marriage. You might think that these are current topics. So we have to discuss the social policy implications of, for instance, outlawing abortion. But when you actually read those decisions, they are often just historical discourses, which to me, as a Finn coming from a Finnish legal culture, if you debate abortion in 2022 by seeing what people said in the Middle Ages about abortion, it just seems to be that the focus is a bit misplaced. And I'm here, I'll speak about Dobbs in a while, but let's start with another famous case by the US Supreme Court. This one is on same-sex marriage. I suppose that's a big topic, has been a big topic in Argentina as well, in many countries and many cultures. That has been a big debate. And you may know that in 2015, the US Supreme Court said that actually the Constitution safeguards right to a same-sex marriage. But there was a dissent written by Chief Justice John Roberts, and there's a great quotation here by John Roberts, where he criticizes the majority opinion by saying that as a result of that decision, the court invalidates the marriage laws of more than half the states and orders, this is to me the interesting bit, orders the transformation of a social institution that has formed the basis of human society for millennia for the Kalahari Bushmen and the Han Chinese, the Carthaginians and the Aztecs. Just who do you think we are? So this is the argument that the Supreme Court is engaged in some kind of hubris. They are transforming marriage from a union between man and woman into some new institution, and thereby there's some kind of transformation of a social institution that has been valid for millennia. So do you buy this argument? I always use this in my legal history class for law students, because in a way this sounds plausibly convincing. You start to think, well, isn't it correct? For thousands of years, marriage has been a union between man and woman. It has been a sort of a union to procreate, to have children. So why do we transform such an institution? But actually, if you adopt a viewpoint I call critical historicism, you have to go deeper into the history of marriage laws. And perhaps you know that when this case was pending in the US Supreme Court, many legal historians wrote amicus curiae briefs. So those are basically legal briefs arguing for one result or another by people who call themselves friends of the court. So they're not participants in a lawsuit, but they try to influence how the US Supreme Court decides by giving arguments. And many legal historians said that there's a big flaw in this reasoning, because it supposes that because marriage has been a union between man and woman for a long time, it supposes that it's always been the same institution. But in fact, if you look at marriage historically, for a long time, it was mainly an economic and political association between tribes, clans, families. It was not a romantic union, probably not for the Han Chinese or the Aztecs, but often just an ordered economic and political arrangement. And today, how do we think about marriage? Well, we don't usually think of it as an economic or political association, but a romantic liaison between two individuals. They are committed to each other. They want to have sort of society's approval and demonstrate to everyone that this is a serious lifelong relationship. So actually, marriage has been transformed even before this decision. It has transformed from economic political association into a romantic union between individuals. And then the next line of argument is that why can't a same-sex couple also be committed to each other and want to have their union recognized by society? And this is what the legal historians argued, that there hasn't been just a single marriage throughout history, but it's an institution that has actually evolved over time. And the next logical step might be that we recognize a same-sex marriage, recognize that also same-sex couple can also be, they can have a lifelong commitment recognized by society. So to me, these briefs by legal historians, they were written in a mode I call critical historicism. So you look at historical materials, you try to be, in a way, see how people have felt about marriage and previous eras, but at the same time, you try to see how social institutions and how society evolves over time, and our values and morality evolves. And then you might use history also to transform law and society. So to me, Justice Roberts gives something like what Nietzsche called monumental history, in a way trying to argue that there's no possibility and it should not be possible to use free or transform marriage in this fashion, whereas the other side employed critical historicism. And my book argues that this type of use of legal history originates with legal realists. It's actually interesting if you look at what are the main works of some key legal realists. Oliver W. Holmes, it was the common law, a historical study of common law. Axel Hegström, his history of Roman law that he composed for nearly 2 decades. And it's funny because O.W. Holmes was a practicing attorney. Axel Hegström, he was not a lawyer, he was a philosopher by training. Yet, their main works were works of legal history. To me, that's not obvious why they would do it. And I suggest in this book that the reason is that they live in an era when the main legal thought was still the work of Friedrich Carl Savigny and his associates, that German historical school, obviously evolving over the 19th century. But when Holmes and Hegström and others began to work on legal philosophy, the main school was still legal historicism of Savigny. And if you don't know the details of how Savigny envisioned legal history, it was also monumental. He was trying to recover the national soul of German thought by going to Roman sources, how they had been applied in Germany. It was nationalistic in a sense that Savigny was interested in German legal history and how Roman law had influenced German legal history. Whereas Holmes, Hegström, and others employed critical historicism. So if you know what Axel Hegström said about Roman law, it's quite different from that of Savigny. Axel Hegström, this Roman law is filled with magic. It's so befuddled, it's very unscientific, and so forth. It was a very critical take on Roman law at the time when people still felt that Roman law is sort of it embodies legal rationality. So this is critical historicism, and my book discusses this in some detail how these people use history. And to me, the key feature of critical historicism is the same as it was for those folks who participated in Obergefell v. Hodges to use legal history to argue for legal transformation and for the need to transform legal institutions. And then let's briefly go into the Dobbs case. So that's the abortion case from past June. I believe it was discussed in Argentina as well. We discussed it in some detail in Finland, which means another interesting feature of legal debates nowadays. Even in Finland, which doesn't really have historical link with the US, so we don't really have any close links to the US Constitution. We are part of the German-Roman legal cultures, but still cases like Dobbs, where the Supreme Court said that actually Roe must be overruled and the states must decide themselves whether abortion is lawful or unlawful, was discussed. Some members of parliament in Finland, in fact, proposed that we have to amend the Finnish constitution to include a right to abortion. Although we have a right to privacy in the constitution, the written constitution, which obviously covers abortion rights as well, but they felt that if this is the rule and way where the US Supreme Court is going, we have to safeguard abortion by amending this constitution. And I believe that's how US law often influences global debates, not people following the US law, but trying to beginning to say that let's do this so that we don't go the way that the US has been going. And if you look at the Dobbs decision, it's really, especially the majority opinion overruling Roe, it's a long historical discourse on abortion. But again, it's not really critical historicism because the ultimate takeaway of critical historicism, people like O.W. Holmes, was that he felt that, well, it's often useful to have a look at legal history to understand how we have come to the present day, what kind of legal institutions and concepts we have inherited from the past. But at the same time, when we discuss current topics, at some point we have to decide for ourselves whether this is a legal institution we want to preserve or uphold, or whether we want to abolish because we believe that society has changed. There has been some kind of social evolution, which makes the old legal institutional concept antiquated. And to me, this is something that's missing from the majority opinion in Dobbs. There's a lot of historical discourse on how abortion has been treated in common law and in the United States. But finally, the majority should have taken an opinion whether we want, in any event, safeguard abortion day. And it seems to me that history really doesn't answer. We can look at history, but ultimately the decision is for us to make. And to me, it seems that the US Supreme Court nowadays often uses history as a camouflage, saying that, well, we can't really do anything, we have to overrule because look at history, we have weight of history on our shoulders. Abortion hasn't been recognized in common law, so we just have to overrule Roe. And to me, that's camouflage. And in fact, the majority of justices were driven by anti-abortion agenda, because it's also funny that if you look at originalism in the US, nobody is consistent in their originalism, because if you would go back to 1789, when the Constitution was enacted, it would be such a strange document and strange Constitution for 2022 that nobody's willing to go consistently into originalist mode. So usually the US Supreme Court applies originalism only in very particular cases like abortion, gun rights, affirmative action, some administrative agencies, but not consistently for all issues, which seems to me that there's still work in legal realist mode to unpack what the US Supreme Court is doing, how they use legal history tactically, and then to provide a different historical reading, emphasizing how society has evolved since the founding of the US Republic. So if you're interested in that type of use of legal history, my book tries to give an overview on how legal realists employed legal history. But let's go into the second chapter of my book, and that's it adopts a concept from Max Weber, one of the great theories of secularization. And to me, Max Weber is interesting because his theory underlies how secularization doesn't necessarily only pertain to the role of the church in society, but it's more encompassing phenomenon and relates how people discuss. It's a disenchantment of the world, so magic, religion, that type of language and worldview gets narrower all the time. People still may have some religious sentiments in their private life. If you look at how society functions, how law functions, how legal science functions, the role of religion and mystery and magic gets narrower all the time. So that's how Max Weber describes disenchantment of the world. And if you look at great texts on legal realism, think of Axel Hegerström or Alf Ross and others. If there's one word to describe their legal theory, that's, to me, it would be secular legal theory, something where natural law theory, religion, moral cognitivism, magic doesn't play a role. It's really a scientific, Weberian, rational theory about law. And let me just give you two examples on how legal realism spearheaded disenchantment of the world. And one is moral non-cognitivism. So that's the famous emotivist theory of morals. So these guys were, and obviously some female fellow travelers as well, they were all usually moral skeptics. So they believe basically that when you are discussing morality and morals, we will not be able to derive truths, but morals have to do with culture, where you have been brought up, your personal upbringing, your family, and so forth. So people will have different views depending where they come from, whether they're Catholics or Protestants or atheists, and so forth. So most legal realists were moral non-cognitivists, and that to me is one key feature of the disenchantment of the world. Because if you look at legal theories preceding legal realism, including most of natural law theory, it was still heavily religious in tone. And if you look at, for instance, the late 19th century American legal discourse, there was a famous saying used by even by federal courts, saying that Christianity is part of common law. Today it sounds a bit, we have separation of church and state in principle, and we think that law should be somehow neutral among and between various religious sects and so forth. But most people, before legal realists, believe that somehow the US Constitution and common law, it somehow integrates Christianity and Christian values. And if you look at legal realism in that light, you can see that this approach to talk about law without religion, without Christianity, and obviously these people were mostly atheists in their personal life. So they believe that Christianity doesn't provide moral truths. It provides one way to look at morality and one set of values. But then you might have other religions, you might have secular moral theories providing a different set of values. And most legal realists said that it's not possible to scientifically derive or determine which set of values is absolutely correct. So to me, it seems that the most famous feature of at least Scandinavian legal realism, their emotivist or non-cognitivist theory of values, is part of the disenchantment of the world. Another feature that I discuss in my book is that if you read most of the great names in legal realism who were disciples of either Holmes in the United States or Axel Hegström in the Nordics, they always usually in the introduction to their books, or they dedicate their books to either Holmes or Hegström, and they discuss these figures in great detail, and in a very specific manner, in a way saying that this is the great genius, for instance, about Axel Hegström. If you read Oliver Krona, Ross, Lundstedt, and others, they always say that their legal philosophy is based on the great philosophy of Axel Hegström. So it's not that Axel Hegström is one sort of some individual in a debate, but they really try to build this figure in national cultures, and not only in law, because Axel Hegström had disciples in economics, including Gunnar Myrdal, the Nobel-winning economist, still quite famous, people in political science, even in theology. And usually they always say that whether they are doing law, economics, political science, theology, the associates of Hegström, they usually at some point say that my ideas are based on the great philosophy of Axel Hegström. And if you look at American legal realists, most of them try to build Holmes and his legal philosophy into American legal culture. Many people like Felix Frankfurter, Felix Cohen, many other American legal realists, they were very active in promoting the ideas of OV homes. So they celebrated, they wrote fest scripts, they gave interviews where they tried to promote homes. So to me, it's a bit even weird or funny because I don't see it nowadays. When I go to legal philosophy seminars somewhere in the world, people don't usually start by saying that I'm a disciple of this great philosopher. I'm trying to promote his philosophy, and all my ideas are based on these great insights of this particular figure. So there's something weird about this project of trying to make Holmes and Hägerström seem into great geniuses of legal philosophy and so forth more broadly. So why did they participate in such a project? Why are people trying to build Axel Hägerström into sort of a great figure of Nordic social thought or at Holmes in the United States? And I suggest in my book that the reason is that these are key secular thinkers in American law and Nordic legal philosophy, respectively. So reason why Felix Frankfurt, Felix Cohen, Maurice Cohen, and other liberal Jewish legal scholars and legal philosophers in the United States are promoting Holmes is because, recall the phrase, Christianity is part of common law. If you look at legal philosophers in the 1920s, 1930s, most are either atheists or Jews. So they do have a reason to say that the great figure in American law is O.W. Holmes, because Holmes is secular, he's not a Christian legal philosopher. So if you are Jewish or atheist and you feel somehow oppressed because the judges are saying that Christianity is part of common law, our social life is based on Christianity, you have a clear interest in saying that no, we need new legal philosophy, we need new way to think about law. It has to be secular, not tied to Christianity, and the greatest figure in that mode is O.W. Holmes. So this is to me part of how law is disenchanted or how secular legal thought is promoted, by trying to build two moral skeptics and atheists, so that's Holmes and Hägerström, international culture in the Nordics and the United States, respectively. So I describe this in some detail, but I'm trying to just argue this that we don't, because again, I have a bit of a problem with this great quotation tradition when people discuss legal philosophy and then they say that, well, we have Plato, then we have Aristotle, then we have the Romans, then we have in the Middle Ages, we have Thomas Aquinas, then we have Hobbes and Locke. So, and then they take a few quotations from each of these. And I think that there's some continuum where everyone is sort of discussing the same topics. Whereas to me, it seems that legal philosophy has, it's contextual in a sense that it's bound to a particular time and culture. So if you want to understand, for instance, legal realism, you have to look at as part, not in some 1,000-year continuum in moral and political philosophy, but rather something specific to that time and culture. Let's then jump into my third argument or thesis, and that's one of the great features of legal realism is what often today is called agonism. People like Rosanvallon in France and others have been developing an agonistic theory of democracy, trying to speak about democracy as a conflict between various groups and so forth. So if you want to have sort of a historical pedigree to these types of theories of democracy, I argue that it goes back to legal realism. To me, these figures, starting with von Jhering and his great manifesto, The Struggle Law, but then continuing with works of Arthur Bentley, The Process of Government, and some key texts by Holmes. They all start from the assumption that if you look at law, what's wrong with the historical school of law, for instance, the work of Savigny? He said that law somehow emanates from the national soul or the Volksgeist of a particular people, like German people. That's one theory about law. But people like Bonnieri said that, well, I just don't think that this is a proper way to speak about law, because we don't simply have one national soul, for instance, Argentina or the United States, but we have different kinds of people. We have different religions, we have capital and the working classes, we have feminists and traditionalists. So usually if you look at society, you can see groups having a conflict, and the first great text in legal philosophy discussing law and the side of conflict is, to me, Bonnieri's The Struggle for Law. And again, if you start reading great classics of legal realism, Holmes, Bentley, Charles Byrd in legal history, constitutional history, they all say that, well, this guy Bonnieri in Germany, he said law is a struggle between various groups. So let's see how that works. You might think, well, doesn't this sound like Karl Marx? Because even before Bonnieri, he had a theory that society is a struggle. It's a struggle between labor and capital, as you know. It seems to me that there's a difference if you look at the historical pedigree of these agonistic theories. You can say that Marx had an influence, but he had fairly rough view on that social conflict. There are only two sides, you have labor and capital. He didn't really recognize that we have feminists, we have traditionalists, we have Christians and Muslims. So we have all kinds of groups having these conflicts, not just labor and capital. And to me, it seems that if you want to speak about, for instance, our current law, just discussing a conflict between labor and capital doesn't really cover the main issues. When we are discussing abortion, it's not conflict between labor and capital, but between traditionalists and people who perhaps have difficulties in feminism, and then you have women's rights advocates. So that's one conflict. But then you look at taxation, you might have different groups. So you have all kinds of groups having conflicts. And legal realism is, to me, the first theory discussing what this means for law to have all these conflicts. And usually, one of the key conclusions from this insight was that the world of law, as of now, has to be statutory law, because most legal historicists in Germany and elsewhere, people following Savigny and Buchta and others, they believe that custom and customary law, that's the great source of legal evolution. That's why many legal historicists like Savigny were opposed to legal codifications, as you may recall from your legal history class, because they believe that such a codification would not be compatible necessarily with the custom, evolving custom, for instance, of the German nation. Whereas legal realists said that, well, there is no common custom in a modern liberal society because people have different customs. So if you have Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and atheists and feminists and traditionalists and so forth, there isn't single custom shared by all these folks. So usually the conclusion from agonism was that the age of custom is gone, the age of natural law is gone, and world and legal world today is really statutory law and the democratic process. So the conclusion from agonism was that today law evolves by way of legislation. So you have struggles in parliaments, and then you make a compromise, you have some kind of consensus about law to be enacted. So again, this seems to me like modern legal theory compared to what Savigny and others said about national soul as a chief engine of legal evolution. Because I don't know if you agree, but if you think of Argentinian law past 2 decades, can you say that it's best described as an evolution of the national soul? Or is it more like just the result of various conflicts that you have in this society, as you have in every society? So it seems to me that this is a legal theory suitable for liberal modern democracy. And then let's close this discourse with, well, these are some key theses of my book. And does legal realism have a future? Does it have any salience today? And I've been discussing this book. I thought before that I went to Alicante 2 weeks ago to Manuel Atienza's legal philosophy seminar, and they were a bit skeptical. Many people say that, well, legal realism is a good theory to unmask what is happening in law. You can unmask how judges decide, how conservatives and liberals are having a struggle and so forth, but it doesn't give a normative vision of what law should be. And this is the argument that I often hear, that moral skepticism and social scientific studies about law and how law functions, they don't give you a normative vision of what law should be. It might be legal realism. I just sometimes use an analogy. If you think of theory of relativity by Albert Einstein, it was never meant to be a theory how stars and planets and moons should orbit, but just a theory to describe how they in fact orbit. And to me, legal realism is a bit like that. It was never meant to give a normative guidance on how we should live in our society, but it's just a theory and an approach to see how law in fact functions in a given society. So to me, it seems a bit misplaced to hope that we find our normative conclusions from legal realism. This is a legal theory of modern democracy, and in a modern democracy, we just have to have those struggles and conflicts in our parliaments and elsewhere, and law evolves in accordance with those conflicts and compromises. But I do believe that legal realism still has some salience, because if you think of the context where legal realism emanated in the 1920s and 1930s, that was the rise of various kinds of populism, anti-intellectualism, movements to mystify law, to give sort of metaphysics, as Nazis and others wanted to supply metaphysical theories about law. And we can see similar ideas abounding today. Just listen to Putin discussing why he invaded Ukraine. He has a historical vision, very metaphysical vision of Russian destiny and role of Ukraine in the world. And he certainly feels that he has somehow bound by that historical destiny. Look at how people like Trump are discussing politics. So you can see, and even if you go to sort of elite legal thinking, for instance, of the US Supreme Court, what you see is that not only are they trying to abolish things like abortion, affirmative action, safeguard individual gun rights. One of the great projects of the US Supreme Court today is to overcome separation between church and state. So obviously, we still have a need for secular legal philosophy criticizing efforts to restore the role of Christianity in law. It's one of the key projects of the conservative movement, and the majority of justices in the Supreme Court share this vision, or seem to share this vision, that the role of Christianity has to be restored, and thereby separation between church and state has to be abandoned somewhat. So these are not so different from various ideologies abounding in the 1920s and 1930s. So I'm not suggesting that reading legal realists and rehashing those arguments will help us overcoming these phenomena. But still, it seems that time is right to have a rereading of the classics of legal realism. There's still some wisdom to be found in those classics. Perhaps I'll just close with, because I often hear this argument, people, as I mentioned, people will say that yeah, legal realism is all good and well, but it doesn't give you a normative vision. If you are moral non-competitivist and realist, you can only say that this is what is happening, but it doesn't give you any ideas on how to go forward or what is the normative vision and ideal that we are striving for. And I'll just mention two examples of classics legal realism who were able to take a moral stand. And that first is Oliver Wendell Holmes in free speech. So Holmes was skeptical of the US Supreme Court of his time because he felt that the court was safeguarding the liberty of contract. That's nowhere in the US Constitution. This is the era of the Lochner Court. It's famous part of and famous history of the US Supreme Court. Basically, the US Supreme Court invalidating labor laws and social legislation on the basis of the theory that the US Constitution safeguards liberty of contract. So if you, for instance, enact maximum hour laws, so the employees won't have to work over 8 hours a day, the US Supreme Court often invalidate these on the basis of theory that they infringe the liberty of contract. So well, Holmes was skeptical, he was a realist, I said that this is an upper class idea. It doesn't recognize that we need this type of legislation, and Supreme Court justices, they have these upper class ideas about labor and the economy, and they are translating those values and political ideologies into law. So some people say, well, Holmes, he's too skeptical, he's too realist, he doesn't have a normative vision. But he did have in free speech, but you know that he's one of the great classics of free speech. And in 1919, he began to develop a theory of more robust protection of free speech. At the time, before that time, he had had a theory of free speech which is quite limited, basically that censorship is prohibited under the US Constitution, but when the first Red Scare began after the First World War, so that's persecution of communists in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes said that we have the First Amendment, it safeguards free speech, and now we have to keep a more robust. It's not only about prohibiting censorship, it also limits the government's possibilities of imprisoning people who are preaching these radical political ideas. So I don't think that being a legal realist, it doesn't really mean that you are skeptical in the sense that you can't take a normative position, because in moral philosophy, these people were non-competitivists, but they were also existentialists. You know, they said that you can't take a moral stand. It just isn't necessarily an objectively true one. You can still fight for your values. So that's what existentialists said in the 1950s. So they were also early figures or pioneers of existentialism. And I believe that's how Holmes believed. He said, well, his theory of free speech is perhaps not objectively correct, but he certainly believes in such a freedom and he's willing to defend it. And just another example, and that's one of the great studies in Scandinavian legal realism tradition. But people don't usually think of it as part of Scandinavian legal realism, and that's a study called An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal, who was an economist, but actually trained as a lawyer and was a student of Arthur Hägerström. So he's very much working in Scandinavian legal realism mode. And in the 1940s, he was commissioned to study race relation in the American South. And how did the de facto segregation work in the United States? So he wrote a 1,000-page 2-volume study called An American Dilemma. And he condemned de facto segregation in the South, Jim Crow laws, where blacks and whites had separate facilities and so forth. And some people have asked, how is it possible if you start from premises of Scandinavian legal realism and Axel Hägerström, how can you condemn anything? If you're a moral skeptic, how can you say that this type of segregation is immoral? And what Murdoch did in that study is he studied what he called American creed. So he studied the history of American social thought, what are the values underlying the US Constitution and the founding of the American Republic. And he said that it's possible through social science to identify something called American creed, and it has to do with equality of opportunity. It's something that has united all Americans throughout history, Republicans and Democrats, and the various factions in the US all believe in the equality of opportunity. And what Murdoch tried to show that there's sort of a double psychology in the US. Everyone believes in the equality of opportunity, but somehow they don't think that blacks should have equality of opportunity. And he tried to show how American de facto segregation infringes the American creed. And that book was quoted and cited by the US Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education, where the US Supreme Court said that this type of segregation is unconstitutional. It's something that has been debated in the US. Is it appropriate for the US Supreme Court to base a decision on the basis of Swedish social science or social science undertaken by a Swedish economist? But nevertheless, they did it. So it seems to me that even if you're a legal realist, you can still, through social science, try to define a set of values, not saying that these are objectively right for every society, for instance, saying that well, this is something that has been shared by most Americans throughout history. That's the equality of opportunity idea. And then you have to abandon practices and legal institutions that infringe the American creed. So to me, this argument, if you're a legal realist, you can't take a normative position. You are somehow bound to be a skeptic all the way down. You will never be able to defend any normative commitment. It's just, if you look at how these figures historically work in free speech, in segregation and racism, they were able to overcome this difficulty and were able to arrive at sort of moral position in any event. So to me, I'm not convinced that legal realism doesn't have any role when you're trying to have some kind of normative ideas about law. So that's been speaking too long so far already. So let's go into the discussions. Thank you very much.
Well, great. Now we open the question.
Sure, and there seem to be some comments on chat about questions, or should I? No. If you know how to do it. First. Those seem to be comments. No. Okay. Sure.
I want to ask you about the second period.
Okay.
That you classified, the golden period.
Right.
Legal realism. It seems to me that the works of Alfred and Oliver Crowder were influenced by the philosophical foundation of science of the Vienna Circle.
Right.
I used to, or I thought that, but I never researched about it. So I want to ask you, how do you see that? Do you see that there was an influence between the Vienna Circle to the Scandinavian legal realism, and how it was?
Well, I do believe it had some influence, perhaps especially around Frost at some parts of his career. But I just think of it as the Vienna Circle being part of the same sort of liberal and modernity. So what the Vienna Circle itself is trying to do is to provide a scientific, non-religious, left liberal vision of social science. Many members of the Vienna Circle were themselves quite active in various left liberal causes of the day. So to me, it seems that it's really a transatlantic discourse between various schools. But I do believe that, especially on Al Frost, they had some direct influence as well. But probably not, for instance, on Axel Hegerström, who started his career in the late 19th century, was influenced by Nietzsche, neo-Kantianism. But obviously, the attention in philosophy science was moving into Vienna rather than Uppsala in the 1920s and 1930s, as you said. So when Al Frost went to study in Austria with Kelsen, so that's probably what he encountered in Vienna. And some people have tried to study in detail how logical positivism influenced Al Frost, and they said that there's a phase in his career when he's very strongly influenced by the Vienna Circle. So I do believe that they have some direct influence, but more important to me, this is really transatlantic discourse, because I believe the Vienna Circle as well, they are trying to provide a different set of values and trying to provide an antidote to Nazism and fascism on the rise in Vienna and elsewhere at the time. So that, for me, it's a bit difficult because if you really go into detail of the question, you have to study philosophy of science in some detail and then legal realism in some detail. And that's not really something I'm really keen on doing. I don't think that's my, especially my strength either. So that's why I usually just see them as being part of the same debate, trying to provide a language and foundation, speak about law and society as something that would be an antidote to authoritarianism and Nazism and conservative Christianity and so forth. Yeah, sure.
As you know, Brian Leiter has defended the historical theory that all forms of legal realism are part of the philosophical naturalism.
Right.
So, what do you think of this approach? How profoundly natural philosophical naturalism should go in the actual legal realism, the historical realism, legal realism?
Well, I do think that Leiter is correct in a sense. I understand philosophical naturalism to be a theory that philosophy itself should somehow be continuous with sciences. So it shouldn't be something that's separated from science, but actually philosophy itself should be informed by psychology, economics, sociology, and then jurisprudence or legal philosophy would also be somehow applied science. I do believe that this type of discussion, trying to make legal reasoning and legal science more scientific or more in line with how science was done in the 1920s, 1930s, is a component of legal realism. But where I depart or what, why I don't think that that's a whole story, it just seems to me that you can't really, if you look at how many legal realists we usually associate with the movement, we are speaking about 40, 50 figures at least. They wrote thousands of studies on Roman law, on legal history, on comparative law, on various fields like commerce, contracts, and so forth, and the general legal philosophy. And if you say that it all somehow, if there's one great thesis that's shared by all the legal realism, that's the key or that's the essence of legal realism, I don't agree with that, because I do think things like critical historicism, agonistic theory of democracy, disenchanted way of speaking about law without religion, without magic. They are all to me important features of legal realism. And if somebody says that no, they are just noise, the key feature is philosophical naturalism, it seems to me is an essentialist point saying that there's some key essence and everything else is less important, and that's where I don't agree with Mike. I do believe it's a breadth read that he has provided, but doesn't cover the whole movement. That's basically my take.
I see that somebody is the weather. So let's do that.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Orel from Costa Rica.
I don't know. Orel, can you?
I believe he's muted.
Yeah. Okay.
Hola, hola. Buenas tardes. Hi there, Tony. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. First time I'm actually seeing you.
Yeah, actually. Thanks for this great explanation about this very interesting topic. I am very close to your work because of this Spanish translation, but actually I have a question that is probably, I know this is not probably the main point of your work, but it is an personal interest that I have since I've been into the Hegerström work in the last few years. You say here that Hegerström, Axel Ander Hegerström, the mastermind behind Alf Ross, Lundstedt, and even Oliver Krona, has some important role here, just like a national figure. I want to know right now, in our days, which is the legacy that remains from Axel Hegerström in the current legal realism, certainly in Scandinavian, but I want to know even more around the world in the current realist tendency, which is the main Hegerström legacy in your days. Thanks.
Well, that's an excellent question. And what is the legacy of Axel Hegerström today? And I would say that I don't think that he has disciples left today. So people who would say that I believe in Axel Hegerström and I'm trying to build a legal theory based on Axel Hegerström, because obviously the debate has moved on. We have a great legal positivists nowadays, and many people feel that what Joseph Brass or H.L.A. Hart has said, that it gives a better description of the law than anything that Axel Hegerström said. Or if you are in the more like moralizing mode, you can have a look at Ronald Dworkin or Robert Alexey. So I don't think today anyone would say that I'm still a disciple of Axel Hegerström. So in that way, he doesn't have a direct legacy. So that's legal philosophers or legal scholars working in a Hegerströmian mode. But there's a more difficult question whether that type of philosophy still has a role in the Nordic society, because the Nordics are perhaps the most secular societies in the world. Sweden is extremely secular society, and some people say that one of the great reasons is the influence of Axel Hegerström and his disciples, including Ingemar Hedenius, one of the great atheists in the Nordics in the 20th century. And some people say that the philosophy of Hegerström has had an influence on the Nordic welfare state. Again, it's a fairly distinctive way to organize a society. Some people say that it's a great example for the rest of the world. Some people say that it's a failure, but some people say that we can still see the influence of Hegerström and his philosophy in the Nordic welfare state and how society is organized. But obviously, we are discussing some indirect influence. So how to sort of detect any detail where Axel Hegerström has been decisive is quite difficult. But most people would say that probably Scandinavian legal realism has had an influence on the Nordic countries becoming the most secular societies in the world and societies where the welfare state has been, at least by some metrics, been the most developed. So I believe that that would be my take on what's the influence of Axel Hegerström today.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Is there something else? No.
Oh, hi. No,
besides my field of knowledge, civic knowledge, so
Right.
maybe. But I wonder, what do you think, and what do you think legal say about what we are thinking nowadays? I feel about digitalization, AI, and for example, two things. First of all, if the approach that you have from a philosophical point of view is about like something absolutely new, that means a kind of new law,
Right.
or another logical scope of view where we would apply to these the same principles, but maybe specific laws for specific issues.
Right.
And besides, what's the approach in Finland and in Nordic countries about what we call predictive justice, or what we would be the use of algorithms in justice?
Right. Yeah, it's two great questions, and something that I haven't really given that much thought, because I'm mostly working legal history myself. So things like AI technology are, I don't even know how to use Zoom. So that's sort of my level of technology. But let's start with the first question. What would these folks say about things like AI and how to approach those from a legal point of view? They would probably, at least one point of view would be what I call critical historicism. And that's the idea by legal realists, something that has salience even today, that even though we are bound by history in a sense, there's a great phrase by Oliver Wendell Holmes saying that history is not a duty, but it's a necessity. So what he means is that we have no moral duty to be faithful to legal history. We don't need to enforce all the legal rules of the past. It's just a necessity in a sense that our ideas, the concepts, the ideas about law are usually derived from past generations when we discuss culpability or contracts. We don't start from blank slate, but we inherit the legacies of past generations. So what Holmes means is that almost by necessity, we have to use concepts and ideas that are historical, but we don't have a duty to uphold them if they don't, if they're not applicable today. And that's critical historicism. So he's basically saying that every time a judge decides or legal scholars takes a stand, he has to evaluate which historical practices are sound even today and which should be discarded. But that's what he is basically saying, that some historical traditions are worthy. We should still uphold them because they are suitable even today. But then some things like slavery or segregation or domination of women by men and perhaps many other things, they have long historical pedigree, but we don't necessarily want to uphold them. So it seems to me that that would be an attitude that when you're starting to discuss AI, you don't necessarily have to apply these old ideas and old concepts if they don't apply to AI. So you don't have a duty to be faithful to historical legal tradition. But in a way, you have a necessity in a sense that when you start using concepts, whether A is guilty or is there an accident or what caused an accident or who's liable for damages, you're using concepts that are historical. But that's sort of a moral statement that every time judge decides or legal scholars take a stand, you can't sort of pretend that history is dictating, that you don't have any discretion, you don't have a possibility to do otherwise because we have these concepts and we have these rules. So it could be a philosophy that might be suitable for even frontiers of technology. In a sense, if the old concepts of civil law are not applicable to AI, then we have to develop new concepts. But at the same time, probably we still would use concepts like accident, causation, liability, culpability, because it's difficult to start thinking from a blank slate, from a clean slate, because you start with concepts that you have learned at law school and so forth. So I don't think that legal realism would give sort of easy answers to all questions in AI and legal technology, but that might be sort of suitable philosophy to think about whether the current legal framework is applicable in these frontiers of technology. So that was, but you had a second question and now I forgot.
No, what was the
Finnish approach.
Yeah.
Actually, that's interesting because I don't think we've had that much discussion on. I've seen some articles on, for instance, on AI. There was one article recently on whether self-driving cars, how to approach them in criminal law. But it's only the discussion is only starting at the moment. So probably we are not that far in those debates. So we are having them, but I think there's still a lot of work to do in Finland and elsewhere, how to approach self-driving cars and AI. I used to practice antitrust or competition law, and there was a big debate on how if algorithms are somehow engaged in a cartel. So somehow, for instance, on the internet, when you have various companies selling products, if they're using algorithms somehow coordinating prices, it could be a cartel. So these types of debates were had, but I don't think we have a ready answer. So if we are hoping that we would have something that you could perhaps adopt in Argentina, I don't think we do, but there's probably going to be a lot of possibilities for interesting debates on how these issues are dealt with in different countries, different legal cultures, but it's only starting, it seems to me.
And really, the second question was about predictive justice.
Oh,
I don't know if you have something.
No, I haven't heard. So what does, how would you define it?
For example, there are different algorithms used, for example, to measure the indemnifications outside. There, for example, I saw another one to make a sort of big arbitration for legal cases, something named crowdjury, for example.
Okay, so
it's chosen by algorithms.
So basically, you don't have a human judge deciding, but some kind
You put information and your resolution.
Yeah, that's only work I know discussing that type of justice is by Carlo Tuori, one of the great legal theorists. He wrote a book called The Properties of Law. It was published by Cambridge University Press last year. And he says that he sees that the whole legal culture is changing due to algorithms and AI and so forth. And it's not sure that whether we should have things like individual accountability in the future, or whether we need to have traditional theories of legal decision making, that for the reasons that you have mentioned, that these are actually done by machines. So I think that would be an interesting book because it's discussing how we not really giving concrete sort of solutions to various issues, saying that how the whole Western legal thought is being transformed because of these technologies. So touring the properties of law by Cambridge University Press, that would be something to goes out.
Well, we can finish it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
And I think I have to thank again Francisco and Aurel for taking the trouble to translate the book. It has been really wonderful to visit Spanish-speaking countries, and I will continue that next year, but it's probably Mexico City and so forth. So thanks, guys, for the big work.
Great.
Great, thanks. Thank you.